Okay, so welcome everyone to today's session. We're so excited to have Kwame and Karen Sherman here with us today to discuss Karen's latest book, Brick by Brick. Karen's specialty has been in Rwanda and expertise and experience, but she has bounds of years of experience in the sector advocating for women prior to that. So we're excited. Kwame can perhaps give a better introduction. Thank you for joining us here at Impact Capital Forum. As always, we're excited to have you join us so that we can spread awareness and knowledge on different issue areas that we're tackling, including social enterprise, impact investing, sustainable investing, and as historically microfinance that we've always historically been our passions at Impact Capital Forum. We're excited to have Karen here today, and we also have a few events coming up in the upcoming weeks that I wanted to share quickly. We have a social entrepreneur showcase. We've got an exciting opportunity to virtually tour a facility, which I've been dying to tour in the Bahamas, working hard to preserve coral in the Bahamas and doing much research and experimentation on the preservation of coral down in the Grand Bahama Islands. So we will be visiting that and having a chat with the chief reef officer. Later in January, we also have an event with Jeff Cohen, who has recently published a report on private markets and SASB and the integration of SASB into private markets. So we have a great opportunity to learn more about SASB efforts, which has historically been focused on public equities in the private market context. In February, we have a couple events, one on pricing climate risk into the financial markets. What is climate risk and what does it really mean and how do we quantify and price it in? So we've got some great speakers there to join us in February. Also in February, we will be hosting, which has not yet been posted, a social virtual networking event, which is a great opportunity to network within, for all of you on, stuck at home and on Zoom calls for work, it's a great opportunity just to sort of meet other like-minded Impact Capital Forum members and perhaps find collaborators in this space. Then in February, we also have another meeting of our Opportunity Zone Working Group. Ira Weinstein and Steve Glickman. Steve Glickman, the architect of the OZ legislation, has written a book to help unlock further Opportunity Zone capital. So we're really lucky to have this opportunity to speak with them. We also have, for many of you on this call, hopefully your interests lie in impact investing in Africa. And so Kwame has been spearheading another working group which we're excited to launch, and we'll be launching and announcing publicly within the next few months. We will be collaborating with Impact Africa, an organization sponsored by the UNDP, to host a number of events focused on the types of capital and the types of opportunity that are impact investing in Africa. And ideally, this working group can work towards a more intimate conversation on how we can all collaborate to help more capital to flow. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm just gonna do a quick intro of Kwame. Kwame is one of our board members whom we're very privileged to have. He has over a decade and a half of experience in business, government, civil society, and media across 4 continents, with experiences ranging from leading strategy and business model analysis at the Bank of England to investing in small and medium enterprises in sub-Saharan Africa and human rights activism in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He has written for the Business and Financial Times, City Business, News, Africa at LSE, Modern Ghana, and many other publications. He is an international executive producer of award-winning documentaries When Elephants Fight, which was produced and narrated by Robin Wright. He is also on the board of Impact Capital Forum, Green Gold's University of Michigan African Studies Center, and numerous other organizations. We're so excited to have Kwame, and I'm very excited to have Karen Sherman here with us today. Karen and I met, wow, has it been almost 7 years ago now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness, mudslinging in Rwanda.
Literally.
When I was visiting Rwanda, we were helping the villagers in a remote village build homes. We had the opportune moment of joining on the holiday day where they had all taken off, but they were using it to mix the special clay that they use with the water to literally like sling the mud on the walls, which is how they got it to stick, right? So that was a very heartwarming experience. Seems like yesterday. So I'm so excited to have Karen share her work and research and her book with us today. Thank you so much. So I'll leave it to you, Kwame.
Thank you for the kind words, Caroline. Good afternoon, everyone. I look forward to a productive hour of conversation with Karen, the author of the powerful memoir called Brick by Brick. Our agenda today will cover a range of topics about the author, her inspiration for the book, some of the key messages she'd like us to take home, the future of women's education and economic empowerment. So I would try to sort of have this conversation for the first half hour and open it up to questions for participants if anyone is keen on, posting questions directly to Karen. To ask a question, please, there's a Q&A chat box. Can you just type it in and I will be sure to make sure your question is heard. But before obviously jumping into today's conversation, I feel it would be helpful to get some background information about the woman behind the book. So a little bit about Karen. So Karen Sherman has spent her life advocating for women in war-torn and transitional countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Nigeria, Congo, and a few other countries. Throughout her 30-year career in global development, Sherman has met and interviewed thousands of women. Their remarkable stories of strength, courage, resilience, resourcefulness fuel what she believes to be true, that championing women's education and economic participation has the power to transform lives of women, the future of families, communities, societies, and the world at large. Currently, Ms. Sherman is the president of Aquila, which is Rwanda's preeminent Institute for Women's Leadership and Career Development. Prior to joining Aquila, Ms. Sherman was a senior executive at Women for Women International, which is an organization that helps women survivors of war to rebuild their lives. She began writing this book during her time spent in Rwanda, overseeing the construction of a first of a kind women's economic opportunities center. That is about the author. Now into today's conversation. Hey, Karen. Thank you so much for offering your time and sharing your story with us. Can you briefly give us a bit of a synopsis about the book?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Kwame, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Carolyn, also for having me here today. It's really, I'm excited to have this conversation. So as you mentioned, actually in your overview, I've been in the international development space for really about 30 years. I spent, 15 years working in the former Soviet Union. I spent another 10 years working with women survivors of war and conflict and post-conflict zones around the world, and then really some of the worst places on earth to be a woman. And then I've been with Davis and Aquila in the education space for about 7 years now. And I've learned so much through my international development efforts, and the fact that I've had an opportunity to interview so many different women about their lives, their challenges, their motivations, their stories. The book really is an opportunity for me to kind of put all of those thoughts, some of those things that I've learned, not just about other women, but about myself on the page, having their stories, a few of their stories side by side with my personal story and my own journey, and why this work really is so personally and professionally meaningful to me. And so the book takes place over the year that I moved to Rwanda with my 3 sons as teenagers. But it brings in stories and work over the course of those 30 years. It also talks about my marriage, the whole idea of balancing work and life, the challenges that women face across continents and cultures, and tries to bring it all home in a way that I think says a lot about how women live their lives, and what keeps them going.
Thanks for the very helpful remarks. The book does cover quite a bit of ground, but it seems to be predicated on your decision to move to Rwanda.
Yeah.
That was a pretty bold move, taking into consideration your prior background and locations. So why Rwanda?
That is an excellent question. So, the original catalyst for the move was the fact that I had applied for the CEO job at Women for Women International. I didn't get the job, and was really devastated, actually more devastated than one would be, like, about not getting a job, but it actually was a trigger for me, and some unresolved issues that I had from my past. And I found myself kind of spiraling a little bit out of control and thinking, if I need to get to a better place personally, I actually might need to go to another place actually. And I wanted to bring my 3 boys with me. Now, the sort of why Rwanda, when I looked at the spectrum of places that Women for Women worked, a lot of them, like Congo and South Sudan and Afghanistan, I felt like were off the table from a security standpoint. Rwanda, on the other hand, was, as you all probably know on this call, they experienced a horrific genocide in 1994 where nearly 1 million Tutsi were brutally killed over 100 days of unimaginable violence. But obviously, Rwanda's story doesn't start or end with the genocide. And really, over the last year, Rwanda has become this beacon of hope and opportunity, I think, really for the entire region. They've had huge success in terms of bringing down poverty rates. It's one of the fastest growing economies in East Africa. It's a country that has really put women at the forefront of its development agenda. And interestingly, actually one of the first countries to detect the COVID-19 outbreak in Africa and take a swift and effective response to that, closing the borders, locking everything down, contact tracing and testing, closing all the schools, including Aquila and Davis. Some people have said, why such an aggressive approach? And, you know, Paul Kagame, the president, has said, well, we've lost so many people during the genocide. I don't want to lose one more person than necessary due to this pandemic. And it's actually, it's pretty amazing for a country of like 12 to 13 million people. They've had about 120 deaths. If you look at it to compare to like a place like Massachusetts with 7 million people, they've had over 12,000 deaths. So Rwanda's done a really effective job in this pandemic. And so for me, the metric was, is Rwanda safe enough to bring the kids? And yes, it was.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Would love to hear, in terms of the choice of material for the book. It's quite, some of the experiences I encountered are quite harrowing, to say the least. What was your expectation before sort of delving into the deep end?
Yeah.
And how did that change throughout the journey?
No,
What were the key surprises after sort of going through?
Yeah, it's a good question. I obviously, I had been traveling to Rwanda really since 2004, so was really familiar with the countries and its challenges. But it's so interesting that you asked this question because, I was always collecting stories of women as part of my job. It's part of, monitoring and evaluation. It's qualitative data collection to hear, through your interventions, how are women progressing? And so, I had always kept myself at a remove in terms of this work, like I'm collecting people's stories and we're presenting them in terms of our impact. But I think the fundamental shift for me when I moved to Rwanda, as I mentioned, going through a bit of a personal crisis, that, that distance between myself and the women that I was interviewing and working with was removed. And I came away really sort of at this fundamental understanding, which I don't think I really had before, which is that how much women, at their core have in common, which is regardless of place or circumstance, which is not to say that there are not big differences with, context and culture, but there are some very fundamental things that connect us as well. The desire to be treated with decency and respect, to support and educate our children, to live a life free of violence, abuse, and harassment in peace and dignity, and, really to believe in a better future. Um, what separates us really, when it comes right down to it, in many places is choice, the ability to choose, sometimes from the simplest expression of our daily preferences to some of the more profound and life-changing choices that shape us as women and mothers and human beings.
So in terms of your interaction with these women and the experiences they encountered, I would imagine there were some life lessons that you took from these interactions. Can you share some of these stories with us?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story in particular that really resonates with me, and her name is Teresa. Her story's in the book, um, and and by the way, the stories are not just Rwandan women. There's stories from other women in the book as well. But I did do a lot of new interviews while I was living in Rwanda. So Teresa was 16 when she was forced to drop out of school after her father's death. Her mother was left to support her and her 10 other siblings, and so sometimes the family went hungry. She then ended up marrying a neighbor and had 5 kids of her own in rapid succession, and Teresa was somebody who depended on her husband for everything. He actually wouldn't even give her permission to go to the market to sell crops, so after harvesting these vegetables, she was not allowed to be able to sell them, and she described herself to me as the kind of woman who just lives in the house. So when Teresa joined the Women for Women program, she received training in agriculture, and she heard the testimonials of other women who went into business, and they really started to encourage her. So then Teresa, going from this woman who had really basically didn't leave the house, she started several of her own businesses. She started buying and selling cows, and then she managed a small banana plantation and 2 fish ponds. She ended up opening a bar and a restaurant in the town center, and suddenly all of her businesses began to turn a profit. And so she bought land and built a house for the family. They even had enough left over to buy a television set and a generator. And she didn't stop there. She went back to her community, who actually were jealous that I remember her telling me, she's like, people used to say demonic that demonic things about me, that I'm not peaceful, because they were not used to seeing a woman make money or taking a moto around. And so they assumed that she was using witchcraft to somehow make this money. So instead of getting upset, she turned around and helped her neighbors to start their own small income generating projects. And so Teresa used her money, like many women do, to send her kids to school, to make sure that they both gained an education, but also had a means to earn an income. And when you ask about lessons, like, to me, the lesson is that, when women are able to earn an income, they're able to invest in their families, to transform their lives, to make things better from the next generation. And I have seen this play out in pretty much every single country context that I've ever worked.
That is a very important point you raise. I do notice you do particularly talk about agency and how education and income opportunities that do create these scope for women
Mhm.
to have and make choices. The challenge, I've also been involved in employment opportunities on the continent, and the challenge I'm seeing is when you obviously talk to people within the educational setup, they tell you they can't find good jobs for their graduates. You talk to employers, it sounds like they're speaking an entirely different language where they can find graduates that are employable.
Mhm.
It sounds like you've been doing quite a bit of work from your time with WFW to Aquila. How has your thinking changed over this period, and how do you, or what are you guys doing in
Yeah.
terms of helping reconcile this disconnect between
Yeah.
the world of
It,
academia and the proper job market.
yeah. It's well, I loved what you said about agency, because I really do believe that it's the combination of education and income which help give women in particular, but really anybody, agency. And when I say agency, to me, it's the ability to have and make your own choices. And I talk about how education gives women voice, but it's the income piece which gives women choice. And this can be choices around how money is saved and spent, choices around sending and keeping kids, and particularly girls, in school, choices if a woman is suffering from violence or abuse in the family. And it's why I believe that education and income must go hand in hand. And what we learned and what we're doing differently at Aquila is so many people really look at the marketplace and education as two separate things. So they look at women, they can't get jobs, they're not able to earn an income. And so, but they're not thinking about it from the demand side, they're thinking about it from the supply side. So when we created Aquila back in 2010, we started with the private sector and worked backwards to make sure that our curriculum was market relevant and that it would lead to those young women getting jobs in the workforce. Because what we found in talking to employers was not that there weren't jobs, but they couldn't find people with the skill sets to fill the jobs that they had. And they had to spend so much time retraining people to be able to take those jobs that it just really wasn't worth it. So in Rwanda's case, for example, they were importing a lot of their human capital from other places because they weren't getting that. And I'm not just talking about people with diploma programs. I'm talking about people graduating with master's level degrees, not having the requisite skills to be able to enter the workforce. And so that education to workforce model has really guided us in the development of Aquila when we first launched for women. So we started specifically with the hospitality management sector, which was a high growth industry in Rwanda, and then added small business management, entrepreneurship, and information systems to also high growth industries there. And we have a cumulative workforce participation rate of about 86%. So, which I think is pretty tremendous, particularly given the fact that over 50% of these young women come from rural areas and the first in their families to go to college. But I also think, probably to your point, Kwame, entrepreneurship is really important. There are not going to be enough jobs, certainly on the continent, for everybody who wants to work and needs to work. And so self-employment, entrepreneurship is really mission critical to developing human capital in the region.
And I would also add, I think the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor does a report annually. And I think it did highlight that with the countries with the highest enrollment of female entrepreneurs, I believe 7 out of the 12 countries are in Africa. So that is actually an area in which Africa is a
Is
world
excelling.
leader. Right.
Same in Rwanda too, has, largest number of entrepreneurs are women. I think, if I may, and again, this may be different for Ghana, for example, which is, a lot of them are entrepreneurs by opportunity, yes, but also by necessity.
Right. And on that topic, you and I had this conversation offline. I was born and raised in Africa, and some of the stuff in your book are unrelatable to me because I come from a part of Africa where our traditional systems of inheritance and structure are actually quite much linear. So my ethnic group in Ghana, we do inherit from the mother's side, and even our system of royalty in terms of succession actually occurs on the part of the queen mother, as opposed to most societies where the eldest male son becomes the next in line. So just kind of wanted, we had a conversation about being able to contextualize, because one thing we want people to come out of this session with is not to look at some of these countries, Rwanda, for example, and not look at it through the prism of genocide. Rwanda is actually arguably the most well-run economy on the continent. There is a lot of progressive areas in Rwanda. I think it has the highest number of women
In
parliamentarians.
Parliament, yeah.
Right. So are there,
63%.
right. So I think, so are there any lessons you learned through this journey that you feel can be of benefit to us here in the United States? Because people tend to look at the US as this big kind of progressive movement, but in reality, there are pockets of that in parts of Africa that are arguably more developed, I should say, than what we see here in the United States.
No
Right.
question. I mean, you and I are completely aligned on this point, and I think it also speaks to the danger of a single narrative, right? That this is the Africa story, this is the United States story. And what I have found in my work, because I spent obviously a lot of my time not working in Africa, but in other countries around the world, that, context and culture matter. And that you cannot generalize, and that, my experience working on women's issues, for example, differ from, country to country, women to women. Now, I do think there's some commonalities there, but there's also some vast differences. And, sometimes we like to make things simple and say that, well, it's all this or it's all that. The newspaper helps us often by painting things in black and white, but there's a lot more nuance there. And so, I always was struck, for example, I've spent a lot of time working in Congo and going back and forth across the border between Rwanda and Congo was just astounding to me, where you had this very orderly, structured, law and order based society in Rwanda, and Congo was often kind of a free for all. And, people are really suffering in that country. There's not really leadership that's driving economic, political, social change at really different levels of society. And so, and I would suspect, and I haven't spent any time in Ghana, but it would suspect that it's just a completely different story there. So I think it's really incumbent upon us, not just as international development professionals, but anybody trying to do work in Africa or around the world, to take the time to learn about that particular context and culture. And I'll give you another example. I've spent a lot of time working with Joyce Banda in Malawi, the former president of the country, and she would talk often about how American feminists, other feminists would come and say, "Why don't you do this in Malawi? It should look like this." And she would say, "But that's not how it works here. And that's not how to be effective here." And so I think we might overlay our biases, our prejudices, our perceptions, and sort of think, that we know what that looks like when we don't. And I think from my perspective, Kwame, as a sort of a white American woman going into a lot of different countries, and particularly in Africa, I think, approaching with a level of humility, listening, letting people of that country drive the change, and really look at that within the context of their own norms, their own realities, their own traditions.
Wonderful. We're getting close to the mark for Q&A. I see some questions are coming in, so feel free to type them in as we proceed. I have a few more concluding questions for Karen. So start getting ready with your questions. I have followed your work for quite some time, and I did read your speech at NEID, and you shared some thoughts which are aligned with my thinking that gender empowerment is one of the silver bullets to development in a lot of the existential crises we face in our modern economy, one of which is climate change. And you had a pretty interesting take on how empowering women can help improve the climate. Can you share some details on that?
Sure. There was, I don't know if anybody on the call is familiar with Project Drawdown, but it was a coalition of researchers and climate change experts really looking at what really made a difference in terms of climate change. And interestingly enough, number 6 on the list was educating women, because educating women meant that they would marry later, that they would have fewer children, and that they, in general, proved themselves to be more effective stewards of the environment. And interestingly, women's education also is linked to women and families having greater resiliency in extreme weather events. And so, obviously, the issue is more complex, and there's a number of different types of interventions, but education is a key part of that. And obviously other things. We've all heard about the benefits of educating women for society, about how they invest the majority of their earnings in the health, education, and nutrition of their families, that actually women's economic participation in education can help mitigate future conflicts, and that countries that have higher female workforce participation, interestingly, are less likely to experience internal conflict, and also to use military force to resolve international conflict. Like, to me, that's really important and fascinating, particularly today and around the world.
That's very helpful. Um, I have a question from Nikki. So her question is, what can women in the United States learn from women in Rwanda about starting a business?
Um, I think, what I would say, and I can't speak for the entire Africa, but I will tell you about my experience in Rwanda, is most of the entrepreneurs that I encountered had very little to start with. It's not necessarily that they had received a bunch of training, or that they had startup capital, or they had, great regulations that allowed them to go forward and start their businesses. Most of them started from scratch, and as I mentioned earlier, were really entrepreneurs of necessity. They needed to earn the money to be able to feed their families, send their kids to school, etc. And so, I remember with Women for Women, it was really startling, because the women we were working with at Women for Women, they weren't the kind of women, many of them didn't have finished primary school. Just a very small percentage had completed secondary school. They weren't going to be eligible for jobs. So all of them, by their very nature, were entrepreneurs. They had to create their own businesses. And, we had women doing things like, selling banana pancakes on the street and then turning that into like a multi-community event. We had a woman who started making crafts, and then she all of a sudden had international trading partners in Kenya and Uganda. I mean, we had a woman who was making banana wine, and then all of a sudden it became this big export opportunity. That, what I've witnessed for them is, don't be afraid to start small. Um, you don't have to have everything in place to be an entrepreneur. It's enough to have a good idea, to be creative, and then build it as you go along. But um, scrappiness is not overrated here.
Thanks, Karen. I have a question from Kelly Warner. So Kelly wants to know, in your experience, how have you seen, and if so, the attitudes of men evolve as women find new, productive, and influential roles in their communities?
Oh, that's a great question. Men are really an important piece of the equation. I remember at Women for Women, we it was a women's training program. It was a year-long program focused on job and life skills. And um, being in this program, the women would say, well, it's really great that you're training us. But if you're not training, our brothers, our uncles, our cousins, then you're just actually putting us back exactly into the same environment. So they were really strong advocates themselves for bringing men into the programs, making them part of the income generation activities that the women were doing, building support for that. And so what we found is a lot of the women were bringing their husbands into their small businesses. And, we used this as an opportunity to educate men as well about women's rights, and really how to treat women. Again, may not be a problem in Ghana, but I remember in Nigeria, there's a lot of harmful traditional practices as they relate to women. And, we would have a men's leadership program where we would really talk about men and what that meant and how, you know, there would be opportunities to treat women differently. And I remember, and we weren't doing it ourselves. We actually engaged male leaders from that community and had them do the training. So they weren't hearing from people like me, they were hearing from other men in the community, and it made a big difference. And I remember observing a group of male leaders who had gone through this program, and one of them said, I didn't know. I didn't know that there was a different way to treat and engage women. And I think that's really the case. And so it's one of the reasons actually at Aquila in 2019, we launched Davis College, which is our co-ed brand, for the exact same reason. Our female students were saying, well, what about my cousins and what about my brothers and what about my uncles? They deserve a market relevant education too. So now we have a co-ed institution for men and women, and then we have Aquila, which is our all female classrooms.
Thanks, Karen. So let's talk about current issues with the pandemic. I suspect a lot of the progress we've seen with empowerment issues in places like Rwanda are probably going to take a bit of a back seat. And also in most of these external events, people at the lower end of the socio-economic spectrum tend to be impacted the most. So what are you hearing and seeing insofar as the impact of the pandemic is having on, some of the groups that you work with?
What I can say is that what I've seen, not just countries around Africa but here in the United States too, that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women, and particularly communities of color, both in terms of women's economic participation, huge dropouts out of the workforce, but also in terms of violence against women, huge spikes, sometimes doubling in some places, that women are in lockdown with their abusers in some cases. I know after speaking with Joyce Banda that 15,000 young girls who were in lockdown with schools closed have become pregnant as a result of this pandemic. They'll never go back to school. And I think that's a crisis in many, many places. And so I think the news hasn't been great for women with the pandemic, and I do think it has the potential to really set back women's rights on a variety of levels, unless we really use this opportunity to drive more lasting change for women, and really, from my perspective, really emphasizing their rights and roles in terms of economic participation, and it's certainly around their personal security. I do feel like we have an opportunity. I'll speak in the United States with the incoming Biden administration to really regain some lost ground on women's rights, and to really codify some of that in even a potentially new violence against women treaty that I know is under discussion, that is being introduced into the Security Council by the president of South Africa.
Is there silver lining? I came across one of your articles where you reference Paul Kagame,
Yeah.
in terms of sort of drawing parallels with what happened with the genocide
Sure.
even though it has such a traumatic impact on the people, it did help reset. And I guess if you look at some of the human development indices, Rwanda post this period of time has seen quite a bit of rapid improvement in performance of women in the wider society. Can the pandemic potentially play a similar role in this current environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it can actually. I think if you look at the pandemic as like another war, and how that's played out in a variety of countries, including Rwanda, that it gives a chance for women to renegotiate their rights and roles in society. And so I think if we think of the pandemic in catalytic terms, it will drive change. The challenge will be, obviously, there has to be will. There has to be, I think, will at the sort of political level, the macro level, to be open to that change. And it also is going to take women pushing harder for their rights. Now, in the case of Rwanda, what you had happen is because so many men died during the genocide or were incarcerated, that the population became 70% female. And in that case, the women, it was really the women who were left to rebuild society. And the president had the wherewithal to bring them into the rebuilding process early and consistently. And so you see the results of that today. So I think it's a combination of opportunity and then also political will.
Thanks, Karen. So I noticed you are at the forefront of driving a lot of the new thinking on access to education, access to economic opportunities, the future of education. Can you sort of share with us some of your thinking and your work with Aquila and also Davis Institute on the future for education for women?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. Thank you. I mean, I think if the pandemic has also taught us anything as well, that there's a huge need to reform education, certainly here in the United States and globally as well, and that also e-learning in some respects is here to stay. I don't think it's going to disappear. Now, the program at Aquila and Davis is a competency-based 2-year diploma program, as I mentioned, linked to fast-growing sectors of the economy. And I do think that, when we were traditionally delivering that program face to face, and then when the pandemic hit and we were forced to close, we were delivering our entire curriculum in an online modality. But what we've learned and what we think has resonance is a blended learning modality, if you can, when you have a percentage of your program being online and then some of it being face to face. And that we found that that's most effective in terms of achieving the academic and professional outcomes that are important to us. And the numbers of young people across Africa are huge. It's going to be the African continent is going to be home to 1 billion youth by 2050. And if we're not able to address their future education employment, or let's say future education and entrepreneurship, I think it's going to be a huge challenge. Everybody needs to be able to earn an income, again, to support their families, to build communities, to contribute to society. And so the education piece is something that is both an opportunity as well as a potential threat if we can't work to scale it up. And so I also think the kind of education that students are receiving matters. Obviously, digital literacy and technical skills are no longer kind of nice to haves, they're must haves for young women and men, and really starting as early as possible, in the education. I think that, other types of 21st century skills like critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, collaboration, social responsibility, those types of things should be integrated into future education programs. And frankly, it's those soft skills or power skills that employers feel like are really lacking in terms of, what we were talking about previously in terms of employment. I've heard from over and over from employers, we can teach the technical skills, but what we can't teach is somebody to show initiative or be willing to take risks or problem solve or sort of that application of critical thinking skills. So if we can really, I think, pivot a little bit in terms of the kind of education that we're providing, enhanced digital literacy, I think that will serve us well over the longer term.
Let me ask you a bit of a controversial question. So there's been a lot of chatter within the development nonprofit world that we are due a reckoning and need a Black Lives moment in the sector, in the sense that most of the key decisions that are being made by people like yourself, a privileged white woman. So what are your thoughts on what can be done to help?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can tell you that we're going through a reckoning ourselves at Aquila and Davis. We are actually going through an entire restructuring of our management system. We're getting rid of our global council, our executive team, and we're creating a new structure where decision rights and accountabilities are going to be with the people on the ground who are doing this work. So I couldn't agree more. I think it's long overdue, and I think every organization, whether you're working domestically or internationally, should be asking themselves those same questions.
To what extent? So you do talk about some of the new thinking within your work. So I've been involved in impact investing, and initial vehicle in terms of the impact metrics that we came with. We're looking at job creation, poverty alleviation, livelihood improvement. And if I was to ask my question, where did these metrics come from? It really came from a desk-based assessment. But during my time in traveling in parts of West Africa, Accra, Lagos, Abidjan, Dakar, in my conversation with locals on the ground, the one thing that kept coming again and again are economic opportunities, the resources and the agency to make informed decisions about which aspects of their lives they would like to impact, as opposed to a well-meaning outsider coming in and telling them, you need a bed net. So to what extent is there local consultation with the people on the ground that you're looking at impacting?
Yeah, well, I would tell you this, our entire team in Rwanda, our entire academic leadership team, our entire team, I think 96% of them are Rwandans in East Africa. So they're highly involved in the development of those programs and really driving those impacts at the local level there. Our president of Davis College Rwanda is Ugandan, actually. Our academic head is Rwandan. So I think this is not something that's sort of being dictated by international development people living in the United States, but it's being driven by our teams on the ground, and rightly so. And as mentioned, we want to even do more of that in terms of devolving even our entire management structure to our team in Rwanda. And in terms of the impacts that we're looking at, it's definitely about the number of women and men who secure jobs within 6 months of graduation. We're also looking at how many of them are satisfied with their jobs, how many of them are supervising other people and taking on leadership roles in their companies, really progressing up in their careers. One of the big things that we also look at is really the multiplier effect and how many of them are investing in the healthcare, paying for school fees for other family members, essentially bringing others along. And we have 81% of our graduates who are paying for healthcare, school fees for other family members. So we're seeing that impact really exponentially in terms of not just educating these students, but what they're doing after.
So notice we're getting close to the top of the hour. So I have a few more questions to ask if there aren't any more coming in. What can participants on this call do to help in championing the cause of Aquila Davis Institute, or even some of the themes that come out from the book?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, there's lots of different ways to get involved. Obviously, learning more about our work in Africa, learning more about our education program. I think really, when people get involved, finding what moves you, where is your passion lie? I'm particularly passionate for all the reasons that we've talked about, education and economic development, and particularly the two of those things together. But I also know that there are a lot of issues out there, and particularly there's a lot of issues as it relates to women. Violence against women is a big issue. Somebody may be interested in primary or secondary school for girls. I mean, there's a lot of great groups doing a lot of good work on different areas. So it's really about where does your passion lie. We have interns, volunteers, and others who help us at Aquila. I know Carolyn is familiar with some of our work, and we also do a lot of collaboration with different academic partners and organizations to further our mission and work. So if you are particularly interested in that aspect, I would be happy to talk with anybody after that. And I know that Carolyn would be happy to share my contact information with those of you on the call.
Um, is there any key? You have talked about education and access to economic opportunities. Are there any other key messages you'd like the participants today to go out here with?
I guess my one thing, and we talked about this a little bit, Kwame, about choice and voice and what brings voice and choice, but just that it's a good reminder that choice is a gift, really, that many women around the world don't share, and that some of that act of choosing, because we can all feel stuck in our space and feel like we can't help or we can't do anything, or just that making these tough choices can be daunting, but also it's really, for those of us who are able, it's really a great privilege too. And so just to sort of that mindset around the ability to choose, I think is a key takeaway beyond the ones that we've already talked about.
Are you in a position to share any thoughts for an upcoming book, or is this a closely guarded secret?
No closely guarded secret. I have a couple of book ideas running around in my mind. It could be on global education. I also have been kind of wanting to write a book about Joyce Banda and her contribution on women, because I think she has a really amazing personal story that I think people would like to hear about. And then just another one in my back pocket that I won't tell you about, but it's about another entrepreneurial venture that I've been kind of incubating myself for quite some time. And this idea of being a job creator, not just through the education work that I'm doing, but as a business owner myself.
For people on this session who would like to purchase your book, can you provide us with any resources, guidance, direction as to where to get access to the book?
Sure, I know, and here's the book, and I know that Carolyn shared the Roman Littlefield information in the chat earlier. Would also say that if you want to go to my author website at karensherman.org, it has a link to all the different outlets that are carrying my book, including Amazon, all the usual suspects, and I hope you enjoy the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So in terms of this session, what I've learned is if there is a silver bullet to development, it is about empowering women, providing access to education, providing access to economic opportunities, providing them with agency. And if we're able to get these right, the impact is multifold in terms of this impact on wider society, its impact on climate change, on future conflicts. So it's been a very fruitful conversation. I would leave you to have the final comments.
Well, I think you did a fantastic job summing it up. I really do. And I can't thank you enough for the interview and for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I don't really have anything else to add. I think you summed it up nicely.
Well, on that note, please go get the book. There is a lot of insightful um, information there. Thank you all for joining the session, and we look forward to having you on future ICF events. Thank you for the time.
Thank
And
you,
thank
guys.
Karen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kwame. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Take care.
Ciao.